Have you ever had the feeling that there is something trying to tell you the truth, but you just can't hear clearly, as if, in the midst of your own thoughts, there was a different voice, deeper, firmer, but one that gets lost in the noise of worry, fear, and doubts that keep coming, and the more you try to understand, the more confusing everything seems to get. Maybe you've been through moments like this. Nights when the silence seems heavy, where the mind does not rest, spinning in circles, repeating the same questions without answer. Thoughts come and go, some bringing unease, others a strange sense of direction. But how do you know which one really matters? How to distinguish what is just anxiety from what can be something much bigger? Time passes, but doubt remains, creating an invisible weight that you carry alone without being able to explain. Now imagine if in the midst of this silent confusion there was a voice, not high, not forced, but steady, a voice that does not scream, but insists, that does not confuse, but clarifies, a direction that has always been there, but that few have learned to recognize. Something simple, but at the same time profound, so close that it can go unnoticed, and yet powerful enough to completely change the course of a life. There is a hidden pattern, a way God communicates that does not depend on grandiose signs, but on something much more intimate. It's not outside, it's inside. It is not distant, it is present. And the most impressive, this is already happening to you, even if you haven't realized it yet. There is a path, a spiritual key that transforms the mind into a place of clarity, where thoughts cease to be a battlefield and become a meeting point with God. It is not theory, it's not complicated, but it's something that few really apply. Today, you will begin to see what has always been in front of you, but that you have never been taught to identify. And if you stay until the end, something inside you will change. Perhaps even today. Call unto me, and I will answer thee, and show unto thee great and mighty things which thou knowest not. Jeremiah 33:3. My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. Isaiah 55:8. On this path we're starting now, you'll understand how to recognize when a thought comes from God, how to separate His voice from emotions that confuse you and influences that try to lead you astray, and how to align your mind to live with direction and peace. Each step reveals profound biblical teachings, showing that even simple thoughts can carry divine decisions capable of transforming destinies. As we move forward, something inside of you will begin to adjust. It will seem, at times, that these words are reaching exactly what you have never been able to explain. Because it's not just about learning, it's about perceiving, feeling, and discerning. And maybe it's no coincidence that you're here now. There is a purpose in this. And if that message is reaching you, then you too can be instrumental in reaching others. When you like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. You help this message to reach people who are living exactly what you have lived or are still living. But the spiritual man is well discerning everything. 1 Corinthians 2:15. There's something going on inside your mind right now that you may never have clearly noticed. An invisible field where thoughts arise, mix, and jostle for space all the time. And the most impressive thing is that not all of these thoughts are created equal. Some come loaded with fear, doubt, and confusion, while others bring a silent direction, a clarity that does not make noise, but that insists on remaining. The point is, if you don't learn to discern, you end up treating everything the same, and that's exactly where the battle begins. Because the mind is not just a place of ideas. It is the first field where spiritual decisions are formed. Before any attitude, before any change, everything starts there in thought. It was like this from the beginning. In the Garden of Eden, Eve did not fall first by an action. She fell for a thought. A subtle idea was planted. Did God really say that? And that small, seemingly harmless question began to distort the truth. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't something scary. It was just a thought that seemed to make sense. And that was enough to change the course of all humanity. Now notice how this continues to happen today. How many times do thoughts arise in your mind, questioning, confusing, taking you away from what you already know is right? They don't come as obvious lies. They arrive as reasonable doubts, as justifiable fears, as voices that seem even prudent. But deep down, they carry a weight that paralyzes you. And then comes the other side of this reality. Jesus was also taken to a place of confrontation, the desert. And there again the battle began, not with actions, but with thoughts. Suggestions were launched, ideas were presented. If you are the Son of God. You see, it was an attempt to mess with identity, to generate doubt. But Jesus' answer did not come from emotion nor from insecurity. It came from the truth. He answered every thought with the word. This reveals something powerful. Not every thought should be accepted. Not every thought deserves space within you. There is an origin behind every idea, and learning to discern this changes everything. Because while some thoughts take you away from peace, others bring you closer to God. While some confuse you, others align you. And the problem was never the lack of God speaking. It has always been the difficulty of recognizing which voice is being heard. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. Because the weapons of our militia are not carnal, 2 Corinthians 10:3-4. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. Matthew 4:4. What if, as you listened to all of this, something inside you started to make sense in a different way? Perhaps it is not by chance. Perhaps this is exactly where this battle begins to change. If this message touched you in any way, write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes a simple answer can mark the beginning of a new direction. There is a way for God to speak that many ignore precisely because it does not look like what they expected. It doesn't come as a strong impact, nor as something that interrupts everything abruptly. On the contrary, it comes in such a subtle way that if the mind is agitated, it simply goes unnoticed. After understanding that there is a battle within thoughts, an inevitable question arises: how to recognize when it is God speaking? And the answer begins to reveal itself when you realize that He doesn't compete with noise. It manifests itself in silence. Elijah lived something that reveals this secret in a profound way. In a moment of weariness, fear, and confusion, he hid in a cave, waiting for an answer from God. And then came powerful manifestations: a strong wind, an earthquake, a fire, everything that would catch anyone's attention. But God was not in any of these signs. And then, after all that, something almost imperceptible came, a still, soft, delicate voice, and it was there that God spoke. This completely changes the way you need to look inside yourself, because maybe you're expecting something great, while God is already speaking simply. Thoughts that bring peace, a calm direction, a certainty that does not scream but remains firm. This is not common. This is spiritual. The problem is that most people live with their minds so fast-paced, so full of worries and distractions, that they can't hear that whisper. It's like trying to hear a low voice in a noisy environment. It's not that the voice isn't there. It's just that there is a lack of silence to perceive it. Be still and know that I am God. Psalm 46:10. There is a hidden invitation in this, to slow down, not just on the outside, but on the inside. Create space. Allow thoughts to calm down to the point where you can distinguish what carries peace from what carries weight. Because God does not confuse, it does not generate anxiety. When He speaks, even if He challenges, there is a peace that accompanies. And after the fire, a still, small voice. 1 Kings 19:12. And maybe you've experienced it without realizing it. That quiet thought that arose in the midst of chaos. That simple direction you almost ignored. That feeling of this is it that had no logical explanation, but made sense inside. This is no coincidence. And the more you learn to value these moments, the more sensitive you become. It becomes clearer. It becomes easier to recognize. If this word is awakening in you a deep desire to hear him, comment right now, "Speak, Lord, thy servant heareth." Write it as an open prayer, a door of faith. And please like this video. You'll be helping more people learn to recognize Master's voice. But there is a delicate point that almost no one teaches you, and that can completely change the way you see your own thoughts. Not everything that seems right. It comes from God. And this is where many are confused, because they learn to listen, but they do not learn to discern. Because there is a silent difference between that which is born of the human heart, full of emotions, desires, and fears, and that which comes from God, charged with truth, direction, and purpose. And this difference is not always obvious at first. Sometimes a thought seems good, logical, even comfortable, but when you look deeper, you realize that it keeps you in the same place, stuck, insecure, without advancement. Other times, the thought can even challenge you, take you out of your comfort zone. But at the same time, it brings a strange, firm peace, as if something inside you said, "It's this way." God does not work in confusion. He doesn't mix doubt with direction. When he speaks, there is clarity, even if the path is not yet fully visible. For God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. 1 Corinthians 14:33. And that's exactly why relying only on one's own understanding can be dangerous. Because the human mind tends to rely on what is visible, on what is immediate, on what seems safest. But God sees beyond. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. Proverbs 3-5. Gideon experienced this conflict in a very real way. When God spoke to him, saying that he had chosen him for a great mission, the first reaction was not confidence. It was doubtful. He questioned, hesitated, asked for signs. Not because he didn't want to obey, but because he needed to be sure that it wasn't just a thought coming from himself. And God, in his patience, confirmed it. It didn't bring confusion. It didn't generate pressure. Brought clarity. This teaches something profound. God is not offended when you seek sincere confirmation. He knows that in the midst of so many thoughts, you need to learn to recognize the origin of each one. And this process is part of spiritual growth. Over time, you start noticing patterns. Thoughts that come from God align with the truth, do not contradict the word, do not feed fear, do not lead you away from what is right. They may even confront, but they always lead. Thoughts that come only from emotions or insecurities, on the other hand, tend to oscillate, generate anxiety, and change according to the moment. They do not sustain peace. And perhaps, as you listen to this, something inside you is starting to organize, as if loose pieces were finally falling into place. If this is happening to you, don't ignore it. Simply put, almost as a silent response to what God is doing inside you right now, write in the comments, "I trust you." Sometimes, a small statement makes room for a transformation that you can't even measure yet. There is a curious pattern in the way God speaks that many people completely ignore, because they expect something new when in fact God is repeating what has already been said, and not randomly but intentionally. Thoughts that come back, ideas that insist, directions that appear more than once. This is no coincidence. It is God trying to break through the barrier of your resistance. How many times have you had a thought that seemed important but decided to ignore? And yet, days later, he returned. At another time, another situation, but with the same essence, as if something is trying to remind you of something you can't forget. The Lord speaks again and again, yet no one heeds. Job 33:14. The problem is not that God does not speak, is that many times the human mind discards what it does not want to face, because some thoughts coming from God are not comfortable. They confront, expose, call for a change that requires courage. And when that happens, the natural tendency is to run away. Jonas lived exactly that. God spoke to him clearly. The direction was already inside his mind. There was no doubt about what needed to be done. But he didn't want to accept it. Instead of obeying, he tried to move away, as if it were possible to escape from something that was already engraved inside him. But notice, even running away, he couldn't get rid of that voice. Because when God decides to speak, he does not depend on the circumstances. He plants the direction within you, and that remains. The word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time. Jonah 3:1. This reveals something profound. God insists, not because he needs to repeat, but because you know that you need to listen until you are ready to obey. Repetition is not weakness, it is strategy. It is love that does not give up. It is a direction that is not lost. And maybe right now there's something in your mind that you've heard more than once. A decision that you have been postponing, a path that you know you need to follow, but you keep resisting. Don't ignore it, because when God repeats, it is because it carries eternal weight, and the more you ignore it, the more restless you become, because peace is not in running away, is in alignment. If you are here so far, it is because something within you recognizes this truth. And this is not by chance. At the end of this path, there is a time prepared for you, a time of prayer, of clarity, of alignment. Stay until the end, because this connection can mark the beginning of a real change within your life. There is a protection that many ignore when they talk about hearing God's voice in their thoughts. And without it, everything you feel or perceive can easily get mixed up, distorted, and even lead you down the wrong paths. Because if on the one hand God speaks within the mind, on the other hand, not everything that arises there comes from him. And this is exactly where the essential role of the Word comes in. The Bible is not just a book of teachings, it is the filter. It is the point of reference that separates what is divine from what is human, what is true from what just seems right. Without this foundation, the mind is exposed, vulnerable to misinterpretations, confused emotions, and deceiving thoughts with the appearance of truth. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Psalm 119:105. Realize the depth of this. Light for the path does not mean that everything will be revealed at once, but that each step will be illuminated at the right time. And that light happens within the mind, when a thought aligns with what God has already established in his word. Jesus showed this directly in the desert. When thoughts were hurled against him, he did not respond with opinion, nor with feeling. Answered with the scripture. Every suggestion was confronted with the truth. This reveals that it is not enough to feel something. It is necessary to compare, because God's voice never contradicts what he has already said. And the more the word dwells within you, the more natural this process becomes. You begin to notice when something doesn't fit, when a thought seems good, but doesn't carry truth. And at the same time, when something comes from God, there is an immediate alignment, as if everything within you recognizes it. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. Colossians 3:16. It's not just reading, it is allowing the word to occupy space within the mind. May it shape thoughts, adjust perceptions, transform the way you interpret what you feel and what you experience. David understood this deeply. He not only knew the word, he meditated on it day and night. This means that their thoughts were constantly filtered, aligned, adjusted. And that's why, even in the midst of conflict, he was able to hear God clearly. And maybe that's the point that changes everything for you. It's not about trying to hear more voices. It's about learning to recognize the right voice. And this only happens when there is a pattern, a basis, a truth that does not change. Without this, any thought can feel right. With that, even silence begins to speak. Now, if this message is making sense within you, almost as if it is bringing a different clarity, turn it into a small act of faith. Write in the comments, "Lord, I receive your teachings," and leave your like so that more people find that same direction that starts inside the mind but is guided by God's truth. There is a signal that does not depend on logic, does not depend on circumstance, and cannot be easily faked. It is peace, not a superficial, fleeting peace that depends on everything being okay around us, but a peace that arises within, even when everything outside seems uncertain. And this is exactly how God confirms when a thought comes from Him. Because when God speaks, He doesn't just direct, He maintains. It doesn't throw you into constant doubt, nor does it leave you stuck in a cycle of anxiety. On the contrary, even if the decision is difficult, even if the path requires courage, there is something inside you that calms down, a silent certainty that needs no explanation. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. John 14:27. This peace is not like that of the world. It does not depend on external guarantees. It does not need everything to be resolved to exist. It just comes and remains. And maybe you've already experienced it without realizing it. Moments when, even in the face of a difficult choice, something inside you said, "This is it." No fear, no pressure, just a firm tranquility. While other options, even though they seemed safer, brought restlessness, heaviness, confusion. This is no coincidence. This is spiritual discernment in action. Paulo lived this reality intensely. Even imprisoned, physically limited, surrounded by uncertainties, he maintained an unshakable inner conviction. Not because the situation was good, but because the peace that came from God was greater than any circumstance. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts. Philippians 4:7. Notice, it exceeds understanding. In other words, it doesn't have to make sense to exist. It doesn't have to be explained to be real. She keeps her heart, protect the mind. It keeps you steady when everything around you tries to shake you, and this becomes one of the greatest signs that a thought comes from God. Because He does not lead you down paths of inner torment. He can challenge you, yes, but never destroy you from the inside. His leading may be difficult, but it will always be accompanied by spiritual rest. Now, when the thought generates constant confusion, anxiety that does not go away, weight that only increases, this needs to be observed, because God does not guide like that. And the more you learn to recognize that peace, the more secure you become in decisions, not because everything is clear, but because inside you is firm. If this message is already touching your heart, know that it was not by chance. Maybe this peace you are beginning to feel is exactly God showing you that He is present, speaking, guiding. And you can be a part of something bigger now. When you like, subscribe, and activate the bell, this message reaches other people who also need this direction. Do this as a gesture of faith, and allow that truth to continue to spread through your life. There is a deeper level to this journey of hearing God's voice that goes beyond clear words or organized thoughts. That's when He speaks through convictions. It's not something you hear in full sentences, nor something you can easily explain. It's a certainty that just appears and remains. Unlike other thoughts that come and go, this conviction does not dissolve over time. It does not depend on the environment. It does not change according to emotions. It's as if something was planted inside you, firm, silent, but impossible to ignore. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for. Hebrews 11:1. Notice this carefully. Faith does not begin with explanation. It starts with certainty, and often this certainty is born exactly like that, as a deep thought that you cannot justify, but you cannot abandon either. Abraham lived this in a radical way. God did not give a complete map, did not explain all the details, did not show the final destination clearly. He only planted a direction. Get out of your land, to the land that I will show you. Genesis 12:1. And that was enough. Now think about it. What would make someone leave everything behind without visible guarantees? It wasn't emotion, it wasn't impulse, it was conviction. A certainty so strong within him that it became greater than any doubt around. And that's exactly how God still speaks today. There are times when you won't have all the answers, but you will have one certainty. You won't have all the paths defined, but you will feel a clear direction. And this kind of thinking does not come from human logic. It comes from something deeper. The problem is that many people ignore these convictions because they expect external confirmation, approval from others, or total security before acting. But God works from the inside out. He plants first and reveals it later. And the more you try to stifle that certainty, the more restless you become, because it was not made to be ignored, it was made to be followed. Maybe there's something like that inside you right now. A direction that you feel, but have not yet had the courage to take. A decision that doesn't leave your mind, even when you try to distract or avoid. This is not pressure, is called. And recognizing this is already the beginning of something much bigger than you think. At this point, maybe someone has come to your mind, someone who also needs this direction, this clarity, this voice of God that transforms from within. Don't ignore it. Write that person's name in the comments. It may be simple, but this gesture becomes a prayer, a point of faith. And as you do that, something starts moving, not only in your life, but in the life of the one you are putting before God right now. There is a defining moment in all of this that separates those who only listen of those who really live what God says, because recognizing God's voice is powerful, but it is not enough. What truly transforms is the answer. Many people get to this point. They perceive, feel, discern, but they stop there. They think too much, they analyze too much, they wait for the perfect moment, the ideal condition, absolute confirmation. And in the meantime, time passes, and the opportunity is lost. Because God's voice demands something that is not always comfortable, immediate action. If you listen to his voice today, do not harden your hearts. Hebrews 3:15. There is an urgency in this. It is not about human haste, but about spiritual sensitivity. When God speaks, that moment carries a specific grace, a clarity that facilitates obedience. But when you postpone, you start to get into logic, fear, doubts, and what was once clear begins to weaken. Pedro lived this in a remarkable way. He was in the boat, seeing Jesus on the water, and at that moment, a call came up. It wasn't a long explanation. It wasn't a detailed plan. It was just one word. Come. Now think about what happened next. And Peter got down from the boat and walked on the water to come to Jesus. Matthew 14:29. Peter did not calculate the depth of the sea. He did not ask for guarantees. He did not expect to feel complete security. He simply replied, and it was exactly this immediate response that put him in a supernatural place where the impossible became reality. But look carefully. While he kept his focus on what he heard, he remained steadfast. When he started looking around, when he allowed fear to come in, he started to sink. This reveals something profound. Obedience doesn't just connect you with God, it sustains this connection. Each time you answer, your sensitivity increases. It is easier to recognize, more natural to obey, clearer to discern. On the other hand, when you ignore or postpone, something inside you begins to close in. Not because God has stopped speaking, but because you stopped responding. And perhaps this is the most important point so far. It's not about hearing more, it's about doing something with what you've heard. There is something that God has already placed within you, a direction, a decision, a step you know you need to take. And the only thing that's missing is your answer. Nothing happens by chance. If you've made it this far, it's because this message is finding something real within you. And that's just the beginning. Stay until the end, because there is a moment prepared where all this will align even more clearly, and you will not want to miss what God will still reveal to your heart. There is a kind of silence that scares. It is not just the absence of people, but the feeling of being alone, even in one's own thoughts. Moments when everything seems slower, emptier, as if something was missing. And in these moments, many believe that God has moved away, that they have been forgotten, that they are living a kind of spiritual abandonment. But what if this silence is not absence, but preparation? Because God has a very specific way of speaking when He wants to deal deeply with the interior of someone. It doesn't compete with noise. He does not impose Himself in the midst of distraction. It leads to silence. Not to hurt, but to align. Moses lived it in a way that few realize. Before he became the leader who would liberate an entire nation, he spent years in the wilderness of Midian. Away from the palaces, away from the crowds, away from any recognition. A place where, to human eyes, nothing was happening, but it was exactly there that everything was being prepared. The desert was not a delay. It was a process. An environment where noises were being removed, where the mind was slowing down, where thoughts began to organize themselves differently, and it was in this scenario of apparent emptiness that something extraordinary happened. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. Exodus 3:2. Notice the moment. It was not at the height of activity, nor in the midst of the rush. It was in silence. That was when there was not enough distraction to drown out what God wanted to reveal. This shows something profound. God uses solitude as a place of encounter, not to take you away from the world, but to bring you closer to what really matters. Because while there is a lot of noise inside you, God's voice becomes difficult to distinguish. In peace and confidence will be your strength. Isaiah 30:15. There is strength in silence. There is direction in the recollection. And there are thoughts that only arise when everything around slows down. Maybe you're living in such a moment right now, a time when things seem quieter, more isolated, where you have been thinking more than usual, feeling more than you would like, reflecting on things that previously went unnoticed. And if that's not a void, but an invitation, because in those moments, thoughts begin to emerge more clearly, directions appear more clearly, internal issues come to the surface, not to confuse you, but to be dealt with. The problem is that many try to escape this process. They fill the silence with distractions, avoid facing what is inside, ignore what begins to arise. And so they miss exactly what God was trying to show. But when you accept this place, when you stop and listen, something begins to change. The voice that once seemed distant begins to become noticeable, no longer as a stray noise, but as a clear direction that emerges from within. And it is at this point that silence ceases to be uncomfortable and becomes sacred. There are marks that do not appear on the body, but that completely shape the way a person thinks, feels, and reacts. Invisible wounds caused by words, rejections, losses, and experiences that have left deep scars in the mind. And the hardest thing is that these brands keep talking, even when everything has passed. These are thoughts that arise automatically. You are not enough. Nothing will work out. No one really cares. And over time, these inner voices are accepted as truth, even when they are not. A person begins to live guided by what hurt him, and not by what God says, But there is something powerful that few understand. God does not speak only to direct. He speaks to heal. The Lord heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. Psalm 147:3. This means that when God begins to act within the mind, he does not ignore the pain. He enters exactly into it. He touches the wounded thoughts and begins to replace little by little each lie with a truth that restores. Anna lived this process intensely. For a long time she carried within herself a silent pain, a sense of shame, of incapacity. It wasn't just around her. It was inside, in the thoughts that accompanied her every day. But there came a time when she did something different. Instead of hiding, instead of continuing to carry it alone, she decided to open herself completely before God. I have poured out my soul before the Lord. 1 Samuel 1:15. It was not an ordinary prayer, it was delivery. It was true. It was to put before God everything that was confused, wounded, broken, and something began to change. Even before any external response, before any visible change, her mind began to calm down. The pain began to lose strength, because when God comes in, he doesn't just solve situations, it transforms the interior, and that's how he continues to act today. Thoughts that were once heavy begin to be replaced by peace. Ideas that brought guilt give way to a sense of grace. What seemed definitive begins to be questioned, and then little by little rebuilt. But that only happens when you allow it, when you stop hiding what you feel and start taking it to God with sincerity. For his voice does not accuse, it restores. It doesn't oppress, it liberates. It doesn't define you by what happened, but by what he says about you. And perhaps at this moment you are carrying thoughts that have already become part of your routine. Things that you don't even question anymore, but that deep down still hurt. God wants to enter right there, and if that word has reached something inside you, even if silently, answer it simply. Write in the comments, I trust in God. Sometimes a small step of faith is the beginning of a healing that you didn't even know was possible. There are times in life when everything seems out of place. Situations that get out of control, paths that close, answers that don't arrive. And in these moments, the mind tends to be filled with noises, fear, doubt, anxiety, racing thoughts, trying to find a way out where nothing seems to make sense. But it is exactly in this scenario that something surprising can happen. Because when everything around you is in chaos, and yet there arises within you a clear, firm thought, bringing direction, this is not common. That's God speaking. Jose lived one of the most intense stories in this sense. He was rejected, sold, wronged, imprisoned. Everything around him seemed to contradict any promise, any purpose. And yet, even inside a prison, in a completely chaotic environment, God kept speaking to him, and not just talking, directing. When Joseph was called upon to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, he did not respond with insecurity or confusion. He brought clarity, an accurate interpretation, and more than that, a strategy that would save an entire nation. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Genesis 41:16. Notice this phrase. In the midst of a crisis scenario, where no one had answers, Jose did not offer just one explanation. He brought peace, because when God speaks, even in difficult situations, he doesn't add to the chaos. He organizes. This reveals something powerful. Thoughts that come from God have a unique characteristic. They bring order in the midst of disorder. While everything seems confusing on the outside, inside a clear line of reasoning begins to emerge. A path begins to be drawn, not necessarily all the details, but the next step, and then the next one. Thou shalt keep in peace him whose mind is set upon thee. Isaiah 26:3. This does not mean that the problem disappears instantly. But it does mean that even in the middle of it, you're not lost. There is a direction. There is an internal security that does not depend on what is happening around you. And maybe that's exactly what you need to realize right now. Not every thought that arises in the midst of chaos should be followed. Many come from fear, pressure, trying to solve everything at once. But when God speaks, it's different. It simplifies. He aligns. It brings a kind of clarity that doesn't scream, but stands out in the middle of everything else. And the more you learn to recognize this, the firmer you become. Because you stop reacting to chaos and begins to respond to the direction. If you are here, it is not by chance. There is something being adjusted within you as you hear these words, and this will still deepen. Stay until the end, because there is something prepared that can bring even greater clarity to what you are experiencing now. There is a type of thinking that does not disappear with time. You can even try to ignore it. Occupy your mind with other things. Convince yourself that you are nothing. But he is still there. Silent, constant, growing little by little. It's not anxiety. It's not impulse. It's not something temporary. It is a calling. And the most striking thing about this type of thinking is that it doesn't ask permission. It imposes itself from the inside out. Jeremiah was well acquainted with this experience. He tried to resist. At certain moments, he wanted to be silent. He wanted to escape from what he felt burning inside him, but there was something he couldn't control. But it was in my heart, like a burning fire, and could not contain it. Jeremiah 29. Notice the intensity of this. It wasn't just an idea. It was fire, something alive, active, impossible to ignore. And this reveals a truth that many are slow to accept. When God plants a calling within someone, it is not optional. It can be postponed, but not erased. And often that call starts out just like a thought, something that appears in a simple, almost discreet way, but that over time begins to gain strength. A direction, a desire to do something different, a restlessness that didn't exist before. At first, it is easy to doubt, to think that it is just something of one's own mind. But as time goes by, it doesn't disappear, intensifies. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Jeremiah 1:5. This means that what you feel today has not started now. There was already a purpose before you even understood it. And when that purpose begins to manifest, it finds the mind as a hot spot. God begins to speak through thoughts that direct, that bother, that awaken, not to confuse, but to move. And here's the most important point. This kind of thinking can't be treated like any other, because it doesn't come to be analyzed, comes to be answered. Ignoring this call does not bring peace. On the contrary, it generates constant restlessness. As if something inside you knows that there is more, that there is a next step, but you haven't decided to take it yet. And the more you try to move away, the more that feeling returns. In unexpected moments, in simple thoughts, in silent reflections, as a constant reminder that there is something greater waiting for you. Maybe you felt it, something that he does not know how to explain, but he also cannot deny. A direction that seems bigger than you, but at the same time is inside you. This is no coincidence. And if, upon hearing this, you realize that God has touched your life in ways that you can't always understand, but that are real, so recognize that now, even if it's in a simple way. Write in the comments, Amen. Because sometimes a small answer is the beginning of a great transformation that is already in motion within you. There are moments in life when everything converges to a decision. It's no longer about reflecting, waiting, or postponing. It's about taking action, and in those moments, something different happens inside you. Thoughts stop being confused and begin to gain an unusual sharpness, as if a direction is being drawn with precision. Because when fate is at stake, God does not speak vaguely. He speaks accurately. Esther lived one of these moments. She was in a privileged position, protected within the palace, while her people faced a threat of destruction. Humanly, the safest thing would be to remain silent. Do not expose yourself. Don't take risks. But there was something going on inside her. A thought began to grow, an awareness that this moment was not ordinary. It wasn't just another day, just another choice. It was a turning point. And who knoweth whether thou hast come to this kingdom for such a time as this? Esther 4:14. This phrase was not just advice, it was an awakening. Something inside Esther lined up in that instant. Doubt gave way to clarity. Fear still existed, but it no longer dominated. And this is exactly how God acts in decisive moments. It doesn't necessarily remove the risk, but He makes the path clear. I will instruct you and teach you the way you should go. Psalm 32:8. Notice, God does not say that He will show all the possibilities nor all the results. He points the way. And this often happens through thoughts that arise with a different force. They are not like the others. They carry weight, direction, purpose, and in those moments, you feel it. He knows that that decision is different from the others, that ignoring will not be just another choice, it will be a loss. But along with this clarity, there is also confrontation. Because deciding requires positioning. It requires giving up something, facing the unknown, leaving the comfortable place. And this is where many retreat, not for lack of direction, but for fear of obeying. Esther could have ignored it. I could have rationalized, waited longer, sought more security, but she understood something profound. When God reveals the moment, to postpone is to miss the right time. And maybe you're exactly in a moment like that, a decision that can no longer be pushed. A thought that came back with more force, bringing a clarity that was not so evident before. This is not pressure. It is direction, and the more you try to run away, the more it comes back, because when God speaks at critical moments, He is not just suggesting, He's leading. This word is not for everyone. If you're here, it's because God is dealing with something specific within you, and there is still more to be revealed. Stick around until the end, because what comes next can confirm exactly what you need to understand at this point. There is an even deeper dimension in the way God communicates with the human mind, a language that comes not only in words, but in images, scenes, dreams that seem too real to be ignored. And often these experiences leave a different mark, as if they carry a spiritual weight that goes beyond a simple, ordinary thought. Maybe you've experienced something like this, a dream that remained in your memory with vivid details, or an image that popped into your mind unexpectedly, bringing a sense of meaning, even if you didn't fully understand it at the time. This is not something new. Since biblical times, God has used this form of communication. God speaks in dreams or in visions of the night. Job 33:14-15. But there is something important here. Not every dream comes from God, nor does every image carry divine direction. That is why discernment remains essential. Daniel lived surrounded by this type of manifestation. Not only did he have visions, he understood that it needed to be interpreted wisely. When the king had a disturbing dream, no one could explain it. But Daniel recognized that there was something spiritual there, something that came from God and that needed to be clearly revealed. It reveals the deep and the hidden. Daniel 2:22. Notice, God doesn't just show, He reveals. There is a difference. Showing can generate confusion, but revealing brings understanding, and this understanding does not come automatically. It requires alignment. Jose, for example, received direction in dreams that completely changed the course of his life and his family. They were not ordinary dreams. They were clear, direct, loaded with purpose. But the most important thing was not just to receive, it was to recognize and obey. And here's the point that many overlook. God may use images and dreams to speak, but he never contradicts his own word. Everything needs to go through the same filter, the same alignment that has already been established. Because when it comes from God, even if it seems symbolic, even if it's not entirely clear at first, there is a peace, a coherence, a connection with what is true. Now, think carefully. How many times have you discarded something like this? A dream that felt different, an internal impression that you couldn't explain, an image that arose and then you ignored. Not everything should be followed, but not everything should be discarded either. There is a sensitivity that needs to be developed. Be careful not to accept everything, but also in not rejecting what may be God trying to speak in a deeper way. And when that sensitivity grows, you start noticing patterns. He begins to understand when something is just the fruit of the tired mind, and when it carries something beyond. Because God keeps speaking, sometimes in words, sometimes in silence, and, at certain moments, in images that directly touch what words cannot reach. There is a truth that completely changes this journey of hearing God's voice. It is not just about God speaking, it is about the condition of the mind that is listening. Because the same voice that directs can be ignored, distorted, or even confused, depending on how the mind is formed. And this is where a process that many avoid, but which is essential, comes in: the renewal of the mind. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Romans 12:2. Notice that it is not automatic. It doesn't happen overnight. It is a continuous process, a daily construction. Because the thoughts you have today have been shaped by past experiences, environments, beliefs, and even wounds. And if this is not addressed, the way you hear from God will also be affected. A disorganized mind, loaded with old patterns, tends to confuse God's voice with emotions, fears, or even momentary impulses. A renewed mind begins to recognize more easily what comes from him. This means that listening to God is not just a spiritual moment, it's a lifestyle. Paul reveals something profound when he says, "We have the mind of Christ," 1 Corinthians 2:16. This does not mean that divine thoughts arise automatically all the time. It means that there is a potential, a real possibility of thinking as Christ would think. But this needs to be developed. And how does this happen? Through that which you allow to remain within your mind. That which you feed, that which you repeat, that which you accept as truth. Thoughts aligned with God are not born ready. They are cultivated. And that changes everything. Because instead of just waiting to hear something from God, you begin to prepare the internal environment to recognize when he speaks. Your mind becomes more sensitive, clearer, more stable. And little by little, what once seemed confusing begins to make sense. The voice that once seemed distant begins to become familiar. But there is an important detail. This process requires intention. It doesn't happen automatically. It requires choice. It requires a decision to leave certain thoughts behind and allow new patterns to be formed. And maybe that's exactly what's happening to you right now. As you hear these words, something inside you begins to reorganize itself, as if a new way of thinking was being built, little by little. This is no coincidence. And when you understand that this transformation is not just for you, but you can reach other people who also need this clarity, everything takes on a new meaning. Just as this message has come to you, it can reach many others who are experiencing confusion, doubt, and silence. By liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and activating the bell, you become a part of it. An instrument for this truth to continue reaching lives that need to hear God's voice clearly. There is one point in the spiritual journey that can be uncomfortable but absolutely necessary, when God begins to confront the way you think. Not to confuse you, but to free you from limits that you don't even realize you carry. Because many of the thoughts that seem normal, in fact, they are barriers. Beliefs formed over time, ideas you've accepted as truth, patterns that have been built by experience, culture, fear, or even misunderstood religion. And the problem is that all of this shapes the way you see God and how you listen to his voice. But God doesn't speak to keep you stuck in those limits. He speaks to expand. Pedro experienced this confrontation directly. All his life, he grew up believing in certain divisions, certain rules, certain ideas about what was pure and impure. That wasn't just an opinion, it was a pattern rooted within him. Until, at a specific moment, God spoke to him through a vision, something that, at first glance, seemed to contradict everything he had learned. And at that moment, Pedro had to decide, trust what he had always believed, or allow God to transform your thinking. Do not call common what God has cleansed. Acts 10:15. This sentence was not just an instruction, it was a break in the pattern. God was saying, what you have learned so far does not define everything. There is more. There is a greater level of understanding that you have not yet reached. And that wasn't easy, because changing deep thoughts requires humility. It requires recognizing that not everything you believe is complete. It requires making room for something new, even if it confronts what has always felt right. But that's exactly where liberation happens. And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. John 8:32. The truth doesn't just inform, it transforms. It breaks invisible chains, broadens vision, removes internal limitations that prevent you from moving forward. And maybe God is doing that to you right now. Thoughts that once seemed normal begin to be questioned. Old certainties begin to lose strength. A new way of seeing is beginning to emerge, even if it is not yet entirely clear. This can cause discomfort, but it is also a sign of growth. Because every time God speaks to change a pattern, it's not to confuse your mind. It is to free your spirit, and the more you allow this transformation, the freer you become to listen clearly. Because a mind stuck in limitations cannot perceive the breadth of God's voice, but an open, willing, aligned mind begins to see beyond. Begin to understand that God is not limited to what you have always known. And that's when everything really starts to expand. There is a level where hearing God's voice is no longer an effort, and it becomes something natural. Not because God has begun to speak more, but because you have begun to stay closer. Because there's a difference between trying to listen to God in isolated moments and live in an environment where He is constantly present. And this is exactly what transforms the quality of your thoughts. When one approaches the presence of God continuously, something begins to change internally. The mind, which was previously unstable, loaded with noise and distractions, begins to adjust. Thoughts that were once confusing are being replaced by clarity. What used to generate doubt begins to gain direction. It's not something forced, it is a consequence of proximity. David understood this in a profound way. He was not only looking for answers, nor only moments of relief. He wished to remain. One thing I asked of the Lord, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord. Psalm 27:4. Notice the intention. It's not visiting. It's not going once in a while. It is to live. It's living in this place. Because David knew that when you abide in the presence, your thoughts cease to be your own alone and begin to be influenced by God Himself. And that changes everything. Because instead of constantly struggling to discern, you begin to realize that many thoughts are already aligned. They are born with peace, with direction, with truth, not because you tried harder, but because you are in the right environment. In your presence, there is a fullness of joy. Psalm 16:11. And this fullness is not only emotional, it's mental too. It is a state where the mind finds rest, where thoughts cease to be a battlefield and become a space of communion. But here's something important. This doesn't happen automatically. Staying in the presence is a daily choice. It is deciding, even in the midst of routine, to turn one's attention to God. It is to create moments of silence, prayer, connection. It is to value this internal space where he speaks. And the more you do it, the more natural it becomes, the more sensitive you become. It is easier to recognize when a thought does not belong to that environment. Because when you get used to the presence, anything that doesn't carry peace starts to stand out. And maybe that's what's starting to happen to you now. A different perception, a clearer awareness, a sense that something inside is adjusting, as if your mind is finding a new place to dwell. If this truth is finding a place within you, answer it simply but meaningfully. Write in the comments, "God takes care of me." Because when you state that, you're not just writing, it is aligning your thoughts with the presence that transforms everything. There is a moment when everything starts to make more sense, not because you received an external explanation, but because something inside you confirms it. It is as if suddenly that doubt that once seemed so strong lost space to a silent, firm certainty, difficult to explain but impossible to deny. This is the inward witness of the Holy Spirit. Because God doesn't just speak through thoughts, it confirms these thoughts within the Spirit. It doesn't leave you at a loss, trying to guess the right one. It guides, adjusts, and then confirms in a deep, internal, personal way. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are the sons of God. Romans 8:14. Being guided is not just about listening in a direction, it is to feel a drive. It is realizing that there is something leading you, holding you back, adjusting you inside. Sometimes not with clear words, but with a strong sense of go or don't go. Paul lived this in a very practical way. At one point he was determined to go to certain regions, but something inside him stopped him. It wasn't an audible voice, it wasn't a visible barrier, it was an internal direction, and he knew how to recognize it. This shows that the Holy Spirit does not only point out paths, it also closes doors within you. It takes peace out of certain decisions, blocks directions that look good on the outside, but are not aligned with God's purpose. And this requires sensitivity, because many times the mind wants to insist, it wants to justify, it wants to follow what seems logical, but the Spirit perceives something different, a restlessness, a discomfort, an absence of peace that cannot be ignored. The Spirit testifies with our spirit, Romans 8:16. This testimony does not scream. He confirms. He doesn't force it. He aligns, and the more you learn to recognize this, the safer you become. Not because he knows everything, but because he feels when he is on the right path. And it completely changes the way you live. Decisions are no longer just rational, they become spiritual. Paths are no longer chosen only by what seems best, and they come to be defined by what is confirmed within you. And maybe you've already experienced it without realizing it. Moments when something inside prevented you from following or pushed you to act, even without fully understanding it. That feeling of, "this isn't right," or "it's this way." This is not just intuition, it's God speaking and confirming. And the more you learn to trust that testimony, the clearer your walk becomes, because you stop depending only on what you see and begins to live guided by what you feel deep inside. What you will hear now may be the exact answer God wants to give you, but many let this moment pass because they do not recognize this sign in time. Stay until the end, because what is yet to be revealed can confirm exactly what you need to discern today. God does not always speak when everything is under control. In fact, it is often precisely when something goes unplanned that he begins to act more clearly. Because there are paths that seem right in the human mind, well-structured, organized, but they do not lead to the destiny that God has prepared. And this is where interruptions come in. Those unexpected changes, decisions that need to be reviewed, situations that arise suddenly and completely break the flow of what you had planned. At first, this can lead to frustration, confusion, even questioning. But what few realize is that many times these interruptions carry direction. They don't come to delay, they come to adjust. Saul was exactly in that place. He had a clear plan, a strong conviction that he was doing the right thing. His mind was decided, his steps were in line with what he believed, but in the middle of the way, something happened. An interruption. Without warning, without preparation, without apparent logic. Everything stopped. And at that moment, in the middle of what seemed like a sudden break in his trajectory, a voice manifested itself. "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Acts 9:4. That question didn't just cut the way, completely transformed his mind. What once seemed right began to be questioned. What he defended with such certainty began to lose meaning. And that's how God acts when he wants to redirect someone. He doesn't just suggest, he interrupts. He gets in the way and changes direction. Not to confuse, but to reveal something that you couldn't see following the same pace. A man's heart plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. Proverbs 16:9. That means you can have plans, you can organize, you can think, but there is a greater direction being led, and when necessary, God intervenes. The problem is that many resist these interruptions. They try to maintain control, insist on the original plan, ignore the signs. Because it is difficult to accept that something unexpected can in fact be a move of God. But when you start to understand that, something changes. You start to observe more carefully. What once seemed just a problem is beginning to be analyzed in a different way. A thought that arises in the middle of an unexpected situation gains more weight. A sudden change is no longer just a nuisance, and it becomes a possibility. Because God also speaks through what you didn't plan. And perhaps, looking back at your own life, there are moments like that. Situations that broke their plans, paths that were interrupted, decisions that needed to be changed without clear explanation. But what if that wasn't a mistake, but a direction? What if, in the midst of this interruption, God was trying to reach your mind in a way that you wouldn't have realized if everything had continued as it was? Because sometimes you have to stop and listen, and sometimes you have to change everything and to finally understand. There is a very thin line within the mind that few people can clearly perceive. The difference between fear and God's warning. Because at first glance, the two may seem the same. Both come up as a wake-up call. Both make you stop, think, reconsider. But the origin and effect are completely different. Fear paralyzes. The warning directs. Fear confuses, accelerates thoughts, creates negative scenarios, makes you imagine everything going wrong without offering a way out. It imprisons, suffocates, takes away peace, and does not deliver clarity. God's warning, on the other hand, can even bring seriousness. It can even draw attention. But it is accompanied by direction, a path, a clear action. For God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power. 2 Timothy 1:7. That changes everything, because it means that not every thought that seems alert comes from God. Some are just reflections of insecurities, past experiences, or accumulated anxiety. And if you don't learn to discern, you may end up making fear-based decisions, thinking that you are being guided. Joseph, the father of Jesus, lived exactly this kind of experience. At a critical moment, he received a warning in a dream. It was not a confused thought nor a vague feeling. It was clear, direct, specific. Arise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt. Matthew 2:13. Notice the difference. God didn't just warn of the danger. He showed what to do. There was direction along with the warning. There was no despair. There was no panic. There was clarity, and this is what differentiates what comes from God from what comes from fear. When God warns, he prepares. When fear speaks, it disorganizes. Maybe you've experienced it. moments when a thought seemed urgent, but instead of bringing a solution, it only increased anxiety, and other moments when, even in the face of a serious situation, a calm, firm direction emerged, almost like an internal instruction. This difference needs to be noticed, because important decisions can be made from this. Paths can be avoided or followed depending on which voice you choose to hear, and the more you develop that sensitivity, the clearer it becomes. You start to recognize when something is pushing you out of fear, and when something is guiding you with purpose. God does not work in emotional confusion. He can warn, but he always leads. It may show a risk, but it also reveals the path of protection. And perhaps right now, there is something in your heart that you need to discern. A thought that you don't know if it's fear or direction. Don't ignore it. Bring it to God. And if there is something that you feel needs an intervention, something that has taken away your peace or generated doubt within you, set it in motion now. Write your prayer request in the comments. It may be simple, but it is a step of faith. Because when you express, you make room. And when there is faith involved, God begins to act in ways that go beyond what you can imagine. There are times when a thought arises differently. It's not directly connected to your life. It doesn't feel like something you were reflecting on, but suddenly someone comes to your mind. A name, a face, a situation. And that remains for a few moments, as if asking for attention. Many people ignore these moments. They think it's a coincidence, a random memory, something unimportant. But in many cases, that's God calling you to something greater. Intercede. Because not every thought God puts inside you is about you. Some are invitations. Invitations to participate in something that is happening in the spiritual world, far beyond what the eye can see. Abraham lived this in a remarkable way. God revealed to him what was about to happen to Sodom. And at that moment, something awoke inside him. It wasn't indifference, it wasn't distance. It was a deep sense of responsibility. He began to intercede. Far be it from thee to do such a thing. Genesis 18:25. Notice the boldness and sensitivity. Abraham didn't just listen, he replied. He entered into a dialogue with God, moved by a spiritual consciousness that was activated within him. A thought that was not born of logic, but of an alignment with the heart of God. And this reveals something powerful. When God wants to act in certain situations, he often looks for someone willing to take a stand. I sought among them a man to cover the wall. Ezekiel 22:30. This means that there are times when God plants a thought inside someone not to inform, but to mobilize, to generate prayer, intercession, cry. And maybe you've felt it, thinking of someone for no apparent reason, feeling a sudden concern for a person, having an impulse to pray for something specific, even without fully understanding why. This should not be ignored. Because in those moments, you're not just thinking, you are being invited to become an instrument, to participate in something that can impact lives, situations, paths that you can't even see. And the most impressive thing is that many of these battles are won before they even become visible, through someone who simply responded to that impulse and prayed. It's not about having all the answers. It's not about understanding everything. It's about obeying what emerges clearly within you. Because when God finds someone willing to intercede, he finds someone who is aligned with what he wants to do. And the more you respond to these impulses, the more sensitive you become. More often this happens. It becomes clearer when God is calling you to pray. And so your thoughts are no longer just yours, and they begin to carry eternal purpose. There are thoughts that seem to go against everything you feel. They arise at unexpected moments, bringing the idea of forgiving, of getting closer, of restoring something that has been broken. And often, the first reaction is to reject. Because the pain is still present, the memory still hurts, and everything inside you tells you to keep your distance. But that's exactly where something different happens. Because when God talks about restoration, he doesn't first consult the emotions. It reveals a higher path, a path that does not ignore what happened, but transforms the meaning of it. Jose lived this reality in a profound way. He was betrayed, sold, abandoned by his own brothers. Years of pain, injustice, and silence. Humanly, he had every reason to harbor resentment, to reject any approach. But when the moment came, something inside him spoke louder. It was not revenge. It wasn't pride. It was a spiritual vision that surpassed anything he had experienced. You meant evil against me, but God made it good. Genesis 50:20. This phrase reveals a transformed mind. Joseph did not deny the evil they did to him, but he chose to see beyond. He allowed God to reorganize his thoughts, replacing pain with purpose, wound with understanding. And that's exactly how God acts. He plants thoughts that often make no sense to the emotion, but that carry liberation. Thoughts of forgiveness when the heart wants to close. Thoughts of reconciliation when all seems lost. But be kind to one another, merciful, forgiving one another. Ephesians 4:32. This is not just advice. It is a spiritual direction. Because forgiveness does not begin with feeling. It starts in thought. It is a decision that is born within, often before any external change takes place. And maybe you're experiencing something like that right now. A name that comes back to your mind, a situation that you thought you had left behind, but that reappears in a different way. A thought of solving, of liberating, of restoring. Even if it seems difficult, this is not weakness. This could be God freeing you from something that is still stuck inside you, because keeping pain binds, but releasing brings lightness. And this lightness begins when you decide to listen to what God is putting inside you, even if it goes against what you feel at the moment. And when you respond to that kind of thinking, something changes, not only in the relationship, but inside you. A peace begins to emerge, a weight begins to leave, a freedom that once seemed distant begins to become real. If that word touched something deep within you, as if God was showing you exactly what you needed to face, respond to it in faith. Write in the comments, God chose me. Because recognizing this is the first step to living a transformation that starts within, but changes everything around. There are times in life when everything seems too big. The challenge is greater than you imagined. The responsibility weighs more than you expected, and the feeling of inadequacy begins to take over your thoughts. The mind begins to repeat questions. Can I do it? What if I fail? What if it doesn't work out? But it is exactly in these moments that something different can happen. Because when God speaks, he doesn't just direct, it strengthens. It injects courage into the mind, not as a passing emotion, but as a conviction that sustains even when the scenery doesn't change. Josue faced this intensely. He was given a mission that, to human eyes, seemed impossible. To take the place of Moses, to lead an entire people, to face challenges that required more than strength. They required faith. And in view of this, God did not deliver a detailed plan. He said something direct, repeated, firm. Didn't I send you? Be strong and of good courage. Joshua 1:9. Notice this carefully. God did not ignore the size of the challenge, but neither did he allow fear to dominate Joshua's mind. He planted a word, a truth that needed to be repeated within him until it became stronger than any insecurity. And this is how divine courage is born. It does not come from the absence of fear. It comes from the presence of a greater conviction, a thought that starts small but grows as you feed, a certainty that if God directed, he also sustains. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? Psalm 27:1. This is not just a sentence, it is an internal positioning. This is when the mind stops focusing on the size of the problem and begins to align with the presence of God. And maybe you're right at that point right now, in the face of something that seems too big, too challenging, too uncertain, and your thoughts are divided. One part wants to move forward, the other wants to retreat. But in the midst of this, there is something different emerging. A thought that says to continue, a silent force that does not scream but insists, a courage that does not come from you, but that is inside you. This is no coincidence. It's God strengthening you from the inside before changing what's outside. And the more you give space to that voice, the more it grows. The firmer you become. It is clearer that courage does not depend on circumstances. It depends on who is guiding you. Perhaps you have been waiting for an answer for a long time, trying to understand which path to follow or how to face what is in front of you. And this message did not arrive by chance. Stay until the end, because there is something even deeper being revealed, and it may be just what you need to take the next step with courage. There are phases of life when everything seems silent. Have you ever received a promise? Have you ever felt a direction? Have you ever been clear about something, but suddenly nothing happens? The days go by, the circumstances don't change, and the feeling is that everything has come to a standstill. And it is exactly at this point that many are confused, because they think God has stopped speaking, when in fact he changed the way he worked. David lived this intensely. He was anointed king. The promise was clear, the purpose was declared, but after that, the waiting time came. Years where nothing seemed to be fulfilled. On the contrary, difficulties arose, persecutions, moments that did not make sense with what God had shown. And this is where something profound happens, because waiting is not an emptiness, it's a process. I waited patiently on the Lord, and he bowed down to me. Psalm 41. During this time, God was not silent, he was molding. Adjusting thoughts, strengthening the interior, preparing David for what he was not yet ready to live. And this completely changes the way you see this moment. Because while you think you're just waiting, God is at work within you. Thoughts begin to be aligned, motivations are purified, priorities change. What once seemed urgent begins to lose strength, and a new way of thinking begins to emerge. It's not visible, but it is real. The Lord will accomplish his purpose toward me. Psalm 138:8. This certainty is not born from what you see. It is born from what you start to believe even without seeing. And that's exactly what God builds during waiting. A steady mind, which doesn't depend on circumstances to trust. Because when the right time comes, it won't just be about receiving. It will be about being prepared to sustain. And maybe you're in that place right now, a time where it seems that nothing is advancing, where you have heard of God but have not yet seen it happen. And this can generate doubt, fatigue, even the desire to give up. But if something inside you still stands firm, if there is still a flame, even a small one, telling you to continue, this is already God speaking. He didn't stop. He's preparing you. And when you understand that, waiting is no longer a burden and becomes part of the path. If this message reached you, it was not by chance. God is at work even when you don't see it, and that word might be just what you needed right now. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and keep following, because this journey will still reveal much more than you imagine. There is a detail in the way God speaks that brings security to those who are attentive. He does not depend on a single path to confirm what he is doing. Often, what starts as an internal thought, it is confirmed externally through people, words, and encounters that seem to happen at the right moment. And when that happens, something inside you gets stronger, because hearing God within the mind is already powerful. But when that same direction is confirmed by someone who doesn't know what you're experiencing, it creates an even deeper certainty. God does this to align, not to confuse. Paulo lived one of the most remarkable experiences in this sense. After having his encounter with God on the road to Damascus, everything inside him had already been impacted. His mind was transformed, his direction changed completely. But even so, God did not let him go alone at that moment. He sent Ananias, someone who, humanly, would have no reason to approach, someone who also needed to listen to God before acting. And when Ananias came to Paul, his words were not random, they were confirmation. "The Lord has sent me so that you may recover your sight." Acts 9:17. Imagine the impact of that. What Paul was already experiencing internally was now being confirmed by someone else. Not only did it bring clarity, it brought security, and that's how God works. It plants something within you, but it also uses people to confirm, adjust, and strengthen what has already begun. Not to replace the inner voice, but to validate it. In the multitude of counselors, there is security, Proverbs 11:14. This does not mean hearing any voice, but recognizing when God uses someone as an instrument. Words that come at the right time, advice that connects exactly with what you have already been noticing, confirmations that seem to fit perfectly, and maybe you've already experienced it. A thought that had been repeating itself inside you. And suddenly someone says something that confirms exactly that, one direction you were considering. And without seeking, he receives a word that reinforces this path. This is no coincidence. It's God building security, because he knows that in the midst of so many voices, you need steadfastness to keep going. And that firmness often comes when what's inside finds an echo outside. But there is an important point. Confirmation does not come to create dependence. It comes to strengthen discernment. It does not replace your connection with God, but complements it. And the more you learn to recognize this, the more balanced your journey becomes. You are not stuck only in what you feel, nor dependent only on what you hear from others. You start to notice when the two things align, and it is in this alignment that the direction becomes clear. Because when God speaks, he confirms. And when he confirms, it strengthens what is already being built within you. There is a silent process that happens within those who begin to hear God's voice more clearly. And this process is not always comfortable, because before God reveals great directions, he works on something deeper, the purification of thoughts. This means that not every thought needs to be discerned alone. Some need to be transformed, because throughout life the mind accumulates mixed intentions, misaligned desires, motivations that are not always pure. And all of this interferes with the way you listen, not because God doesn't speak, but because what is inside distorts what is heard. And that is why God, before entrusting greater directions, begins by cleaning the interior. Isaiah lived this in a remarkable way. When he had a vision of God's presence, the first reaction was not enthusiasm, it was consciousness. He realized that there was something inside him that needed to be addressed before any response. And then came the moment of purification. "Behold, this hath touched thy lips, and your iniquity has been taken away." Isaiah 6:7. Only after that came the call. This reveals a spiritual command that many ignore. First, God cleanses. Then he sends. Because clean thoughts generate clear direction, but mixed thoughts generate confusion. And this process continues to happen today. God begins to adjust what you want, what you seek, what drives your decisions. Thoughts that were once natural begin to be confronted. Certain intentions no longer make sense. What once seemed like a priority is starting to lose strength. It's not a loss. It's alignment. "Create in me, O God, a clean heart." Psalm 51:10. This is not just a prayer, it's a delivery. It is allowing God to enter into the root of thoughts, to reveal what needs to be changed, to transform the inside before revealing the outside. And this process can be silent. Sometimes you don't even notice it right away. But little by little, his way of thinking changes. Their reactions change. Your sensitivity increases. And what was confusing before begins to clarify itself. Because when the mind is purified, the voice of God finds space. And maybe you're right there right now, feeling internal changes, realizing that something is being adjusted, even without fully understanding it. This is no coincidence. It's preparation. Few people will understand this message, but if you are here, it is because God is dealing with something directly within you. Remain attentive, because what is yet to come can bring even greater clarity about all that is being transformed within your mind. There are times when God's voice doesn't come slowly. It comes urgently. It's not that gradual process where you have time to reflect for days, analyze every detail, wait for the perfect moment. It's different. It is a type of thought that arrives with weight, with clarity, and with a feeling that it cannot be postponed, as if something inside you knew it's now. This type of driving carries a different intensity. It doesn't generate confusion. It doesn't create prolonged doubt, but it also does not allow accommodation. It's as if God is speeding up time inside your mind, calling you to act before the opportunity passes. Noah lived exactly that. In a world that followed normally, without realizing what was coming, God brought a direct instruction, without beating around the bush, with no room for negotiation. Make yourself an ark, Genesis 6:14. There was no precedent. There were no visible signs that justified that action in human eyes. But there was a clear, urgent direction that demanded an immediate response. And here's the point. Noah didn't treat it as just any idea. He didn't postpone. He didn't wait for confirmation after confirmation. He didn't try to adapt the direction to his own time. He understood the weight of that thought and answered. Because when God accelerates, obedience needs to keep up. Today, if you will listen to his voice, do not harden your hearts. Hebrews 4:7. Notice the word today, not tomorrow, not when it's most convenient, not when it all makes sense. There is a type of calling that comes with a deadline, even if you can't see it in a natural way. And often, the biggest mistake is not listening. It is not responding at the right time. Because when you postpone what God has accelerated, something inside you begins to lose sensitivity. That initial clarity begins to diminish. That conviction begins to weaken. Not because God has changed, but because the moment has passed. And maybe you felt it. A thought that came strong, of course, almost impossible to ignore. But that, over time, became more distant because there was no response. On the other hand, when you respond, something opens up. Even without understanding everything, even without seeing the immediate result, there is a connection that is strengthened. You begin to realize that God's direction does not depend on complete explanation. It depends on immediate confidence, and it completely changes the way you live. You stop expecting ideal conditions and begins to respond when God speaks. Stop trying to control time and begins to align with his timing. And at this level, thoughts are no longer just suggestions, and they become summonses, urgent invitations to participate in something that is beyond what you can see right now. And when you recognize that, you understand that some opportunities don't come back because they were released for that specific moment. And it is at this point that sensitivity becomes decisive, because listening is important, but responding at the right time is what transforms everything. There is something that underpins everything you have heard so far, something that keeps alive the thoughts that come from God, even when everything around tries to weaken them. That something is faith, because it is not enough to receive a thought from God. It is necessary to protect this thought. The mind is an open field. That which God sows can be confronted by doubts, opinions, circumstances, and even time. And if there is no faith, that which started strong can be stifled before it is fulfilled. The woman with the flow of blood experienced this in a profound way. For years, she carried constant pain, a situation that didn't change. Humanly, everything around pointed to the opposite of the miracle. But at some point, a thought was born inside her. If I just touch your garments, I will be healed. Mark 5:28. Notice, it was not Jesus speaking directly to her at that moment. It was an internal conviction, a thought that came up and that she decided to hold. And that's the point. She didn't let circumstances destroy that. He did not allow time to erase that certainty. She did not let external limitations annul what was born inside her. She protected that thought, and that required faith. Because keeping a thought aligned with God, when everything around seems otherwise, is a constant choice. It is deciding every day to believe more in what God has put inside you than in what you see outside. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. Hebrews 11:6. It's not just believing that God exists. It is trusting in what He says, even when it has not yet happened. And perhaps this is the point where many get lost. They even receive direction. They even feel something coming from God, but they do not sustain it. They let doubt in, fear grow, time wears out. And little by little, what was clear begins to weaken. But when there is faith, the opposite happens. Conviction grows, certainty is strengthened. And even if it takes time, even if there are obstacles, that thought remains alive until it becomes reality. And maybe there's something like that inside of you right now, a thought that came from God, a direction, a promise, but that it is being pressured by circumstances. Don't let it get lost. Protect, feed, sustain, because what God plants inside you does not come to be forgotten. It comes to be lived. And when you learn to guard that with faith, something starts to move. Even if you don't see it yet, it's already happening. If this message is confirming something inside you, don't let it pass you by silently. Write in the comments, I trust in God's action, because when you declare, you strengthen what has already begun to be built within your mind. There is a voice that goes beyond direction, beyond decisions, beyond paths. It's the voice that defines who you are. And while many people spend their lives trying to discover their worth through what they do, God starts from somewhere else. He talks about identity first, because before any action comes the definition. And this is exactly where many battles take place. Thoughts of rejection, of inadequacy, of not being enough. Ideas that are repeated over time, shaped by experiences, words that hurt, situations that left marks. And without realizing it, the person begins to live based on these voices. But when God speaks, He confronts this directly. Jesus, before performing miracles, before teaching multitudes, before any visible work, heard something that changed everything. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Matthew 3:17. Notice the order. The statement came before the mission. The identity was established before the action. This reveals a profound principle. What you do does not define who you are. Who you are in God defines everything you do. And that's why God speaks within the mind to restore that truth. Thoughts begin to arise, no longer of condemnation, but of belonging. A new consciousness begins to form, replacing what previously generated insecurity. Behold, what great love hath the Father bestowed upon us, that we should be called the children of God. 1 John 3:1. This is not just a title. It is a spiritual reality. And when that truth enters the mind, something begins to change profoundly. The way you see yourself transforms. The way you react to situations changes. What used to shake is starting to lose strength, because thoughts that come from God about identity carry authority. They don't just comfort, They break cycles, cycles of fear, comparison, low self-esteem, constant doubt. Everything that was supported by a distorted view of oneself begins to be replaced by something solid. But this does not happen from the outside in. It starts within. It is in the mind that God plants this new identity. That's where he speaks, reaffirms, repeats, until it becomes stronger than any other voice you've ever heard. And maybe you're exactly in that process right now, realizing that some old thoughts no longer make sense, while others begin to emerge more strongly, bringing a new perception of who you are. This is not human construction, it is God restoring your identity. And when this truth is established, everything changes, because you stop living trying to prove something, and starts to live from something that has already been defined by God. And it is from this identity that his voice becomes even clearer, even closer, even more real within you. There are times when pain seems to occupy everything. It's not just a difficult situation, it is something that invades thoughts, that repeats itself, that weighs it down. The mind becomes slower, more charged, and even what once made sense begins to lose its luster. And in these moments, many believe that God is far away. But that's exactly where he approaches in a different way, because when everything is dark inside, any thought of hope is not common. It is divine seed. Job lived a pain that few can imagine. He lost everything, faced extreme suffering, was surrounded by silence and questioning. Humanly, everything around him pointed to the end, to despair, to the absence of meaning. But even so, something inside him remained. I know that my Redeemer lives. Job 19:25. Notice this. In the midst of the pain, it wasn't an explanation that came up. It was a conviction, a thought that withstood suffering, a truth that did not depend on the circumstances, and this reveals something profound. God does not stop speaking when you suffer. He speaks even more intimately, not with quick answers, not with immediate solutions, but with thoughts that sustain, small lights in the middle of the darkness, ideas that bring consolation, even if everything is still difficult. Weeping may last for a night, but joy comes in the morning. Psalm 35. This promise does not ignore the pain, but it limits her time. And that's what God plants inside the mind at times like this. Hope, not as something distant, but as something that begins to be born within, even when everything outside has not yet changed. And maybe you're in that place right now, dealing with heavy thoughts, with difficult feelings, with questions that still have no answer. And in the middle of this, something small appears. A memory, a word, a feeling that there is still something beyond. Don't ignore it, because this kind of thinking is not born of despair. He resists it. It's God reaching you in the deepest place, and the more you embrace it, the more strength it gains. Not to erase the pain instantly, but to sustain you as it passes, to keep you steady while the process happens, because pain can take up time. But it does not define the ending. And when God speaks in the midst of it, he is not only comforting, he's preserving something inside of you that will still flourish. And it is at this point that everything begins to change, even if still silently. There are times when God's voice doesn't just come to comfort, direct or confirm, but to confront. And this is one of the most difficult points to recognize, because not every thought coming from God brings immediate comfort. Some come to order something that you are not yet ready to deliver. These are thoughts that directly touch what you value, what you hold, what, deep down, occupies a very important place within you. And it is at this point that the real decision happens. The rich young ruler lived exactly that. He sought God, had discipline, had spiritual interest. But when he stood before Jesus, he received direction that went beyond what he expected. Go, sell everything you have, and follow me. Mark 10:21. It wasn't a lack of knowledge as it was attachment. That thought came clear, direct, without confusion. But at the same time, it demanded resignation. And there it became evident that not everyone who listens is willing to obey. Because following God's voice at certain times means giving up something that seems essential. And this is where many get stuck, because these thoughts are not easy to accept. They confront security, comfort, control. They ask for delivery before showing the result, and the mind starts to negotiate, to question, to try to adapt it to something more comfortable. But God does not speak to negotiate. He speaks to transform. He that loseth his life for my sake shall find it. Matthew 16:25. This is not about loss. It's about exchange. Exchange control for trust. Exchange attachment for something bigger. Exchange what you think you need for what God knows you really need. And maybe there's something like that inside of you right now, a thought that you recognize but avoid, a direction that you know came from God, but you haven't yet had the courage to fully accept. It's not because you're confused, it's because it's hard. But every time God asks for resignation, He is preparing space, room for something bigger, more aligned, deeper. And as long as you hold on to what He asked you to let go, you limit what He wants to put in its place. And this does not happen in a forced way. God does not oblige, He invites. But this invitation carries weight. It carries purpose. He carries a decision that can change everything. And most importantly, these thoughts don't fade over time. They come back. They are repeated. They insist. Because what God asks is not random. It is necessary. And when you finally answer, something breaks inside you, not in a negative way, but liberating. A weight comes out, a clarity comes in, a lightness begins to emerge. In the next few moments, you'll realize something even deeper about how God keeps speaking, even when you think you've heard it all. And this may be just the signal you needed to understand what to do from here. There are thoughts that reveal something very specific about their origin. They do not come loaded with fear or doubt or confusion. They come with an impulse to give, to serve, to bless someone without expecting anything in return. And often these thoughts seem illogical to the natural mind, because they go against the instinct to guard, to protect, to calculate. But this is exactly how God manifests Himself within you. When He speaks through thoughts, He doesn't just direct your life. He begins to form His character in you. And one of the clearest signs of this is generosity. The widow Jesus observed in the temple had this kind of experience. While many gave of what was left, she did something completely different. There was not enough human logic to explain that decision. But there was an inner conviction. This poor widow has given more than all. Luke 21:3. She didn't give more in quantity, gave more in delivery, because that thought that led her to act did not come from reason. It came from a deep alignment with something bigger, and this is what needs to be understood. When God inspires you to give, it's not about loss, it's about purpose. Because thoughts that lead to generosity are not born of the ego, they are born of the Spirit. There are those who give liberally and become richer. Proverbs 11:25. This does not only speak of material resources, it speaks of a richness that begins within. An expansion of the mind, a freedom that breaks with attachment, a joy that does not depend on how much you have, but on how much you allow yourself to be a channel. And maybe you felt it, an impulse to help someone, to do something without expecting a return, to offer something that, in human eyes, might be better to keep. And at that moment, two voices emerge. One says to hold on, to think better, not to take risks. The other, softer, says to trust, to release, to act. That second voice, it is the one that comes from God, because He doesn't think as we do. He does not operate with fear of lack. It operates abundantly. And when He begins to form that within you, your thoughts change. You stop living only for yourself, and you begin to realize that your life can touch other people in ways you never imagined. And the more you respond to those thoughts, the more it grows. The more natural it becomes. The more aligned you are with God's heart, and that's where something powerful happens. Your thoughts are no longer just about personal direction and start to carry eternal impact. Because every gesture of generosity, every decision to serve, every attitude guided by this kind of thinking, it does not only transform those who receive, it transforms you. There are times when the mind goes into a kind of spiritual fog. It's not just common doubt. It's a deeper confusion. You try to understand, you try to organize your thoughts, you try to find answers, but everything seems scrambled. What was once clear loses definition, and what remains is a sense of uncertainty. And it is exactly in this kind of scenario that God begins to act differently. Because when there is confusion, God does not answer with more information. He brings revelation. The disciples on the road to Emmaus lived this intensely. They walked talking, trying to understand everything that had happened. The pieces didn't fit. The expectation they had was broken, and now there was only doubt. Even with all the knowledge they had, they could not understand, until something happened. Jesus approached. But they didn't notice right away. He began to speak, to explain, to connect what had previously seemed disconnected. And little by little, something began to change inside them. It wasn't instantaneous. It was progressive. Then he opened their understanding to understand the Scriptures, Luke 24:45. Notice this, it opened understanding. It wasn't just listening, it was to see differently. It was as if a light began to illuminate what was previously dark. And that's exactly how God acts in the mind. He doesn't throw all the answers at once. He reveals, adjusting thoughts, bringing clarity little by little, reorganizing what seemed confusing. Because God, it has shone in our hearts. 2 Corinthians 4:6. This light does not come from outside. It lights up inside. And when that happens, the confusion starts to lose strength. What once seemed meaningless begins to line up. Not because all the questions have been answered, but because now there is understanding. And maybe you're right at that point, feeling that something inside you needs to be clarified, but you haven't found the answer yet. Mixed thoughts, doubts that repeat themselves, a feeling that something is missing for everything to make sense. But when God begins to illuminate, you notice. It's not noise, it is clarity. It's not pressure, it is direction. One thought fits, then another, and little by little everything begins to take shape. And most importantly, this clarity does not depend on the surrounding environment. It is born within you, because when God speaks to bring understanding, He doesn't just answer questions. It transforms the way you see. And it is in this process that confusion ceases to dominate and the truth begins to lead. There are times when it feels like something inside you has been left behind. It's not that you've completely forgotten, but what once burned brightly is now quiet. A purpose that was once clear, a desire that was once alive, a direction that made sense, but which, over time, was drowned out by circumstances, distractions, or even discouragement. And then, suddenly, without warning, something comes back. A thought arises, a memory, a different restlessness, as if something is being rekindled inside you. This is not nostalgia, it is God awakening what has never ceased to exist. Timothy went through this. In the midst of the responsibilities, challenges, and weight of the journey, something inside him needed to be reactivated. And then came the word that brought clarity, awaken the gift of God that is in you. 2 Timothy 1:6. Notice, the gift was already there. It did not need to be created nor sought outside. It needed to be awakened. And that's exactly how God acts. He doesn't start something new from scratch. He rekindles what he himself has already placed within you. But for that, he uses thoughts. Ideas that arise, wills that return, convictions that bother again, like a call that refuses to be forgotten. And often these thoughts appear at unexpected times, in silence, in a reflection, in a word you hear, and suddenly it comes back with a vengeance. Arise, shine, for your light is coming, Isaiah 61. This is not just an incentive, it is an awakening, an invitation to come out of stagnation, to move again, to recognize that what seemed dormant is still alive. But there is an important detail. This type of thinking requires a response, because it is possible to feel and not act. It is possible to see and continue to stop. And when this happens, what has been awakened begins to fade again. But when you answer, something changes. That flame grows. The direction becomes clearer. The purpose begins to take shape again. Not in a forced way, but natural, progressive, aligned. And maybe you're living just that right now, feeling something I hadn't felt in a while, thoughts that came back, ideas that reappeared, a feeling that there is more, much more. This is no coincidence. It's God calling you back to what He has already placed inside you, and the more you pay attention, the clearer it becomes that it didn't come from you, came to you. By the end of this video, you will notice how all of this connects in an even deeper way, and perhaps feel something that you have not felt in a long time. The certainty that there is still a living purpose within you waiting to be fully awakened. There comes a time on this journey when something changes deep within you. It's no longer about trying to understand, nor about looking for signs all the time. It's about trusting. A trust built little by little, through everything you have lived, heard, and discerned. This is when thoughts that once generated doubt begin to generate security. When what seemed uncertain begins to become a natural path. Not because you have all the answers, but because you have learned to recognize the voice that guides you. This is the place where living guided by God ceases to be an event, and it becomes a lifestyle. Enoch lived this so intensely that his story is summarized in a simple but powerful way. Enoch walked with God, and he didn't show up again. Genesis 5:24. Walking with God is not just about having spiritual moments. It is to live in constant alignment. It is allowing your thoughts to be led, adjusted, directed every day. It is trusting not only in big decisions, but also in the small directions of everyday life. And this only happens when trust conquers fear, because trusting in God is not the absence of doubt. It is choosing to follow even when doubt tries to appear. It is to recognize that along the way He has already shown that He is faithful. They that trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which is not shaken, but endureth forever. Psalm 125:1. This stability does not come from circumstances. It comes from trust. A mind aligned with God becomes steadfast, steady, less vulnerable to external oscillations. And maybe you're starting to realize that now. A subtle but real change. Clearer thoughts, firmer decisions, a peace that begins to remain even when everything around changes. This doesn't happen overnight, is built every time you listened and responded. Each time you discerned and chose to trust. Every time you decided to follow what God put inside you. And now, all of this begins to connect. You stop reacting to what happens outside and begins to live guided by what God speaks within. And at this level, the journey becomes different, lighter, safer, more aligned. Not perfect, but directed. And the longer you live like this, the more natural it becomes. It becomes clearer. The closer you feel, nothing in this life happens without a purpose. And if that word has found you right now, there is something being confirmed within your heart. If you notice this, respond in faith. Write in the comments, I believe, Lord. because acknowledging is the first step to fully living this new way of walking guided by God. Everything that has been awakened so far points to a simple but profound truth. Listening to God's voice is not just understanding, it is surrendering. Because there comes a time when it is not enough to recognize the thoughts that come from Him. It is necessary to silence everything else so that this voice becomes even clearer. And that moment is now. Draw near to God, and He will draw near to you. James 4:8. That promise is not far away, is immediate. When you turn to God with sincerity, He responds with presence, not with noise, not with confusion, but with a peace that begins within. Maybe your mind is still full, with many thoughts, many worries, many questions. But there is an invitation being made right now. Slow down inside, tilt your heart, make room. Incline my ear, O Lord, to thy word. Psalm 86:1. That is the attitude, not of those who already know everything, but of those who are willing to listen. Now, allow yourself to step into that moment. Let go of distractions, slow down your thoughts and turn inward. It is in this quiet place that God speaks most intimately. Let's pray, trusting that He is present, listening, and ready to touch the very thing that needs to be transformed. Beloved Father, your word reminds us that you are near to all who call upon you in truth, and it is with that open heart that we stand before you now, recognizing that we need your presence to order our thoughts and align our minds with your will. Lord, we thank you for all that has been revealed so far, for every teaching, for every truth that has reached our inner self. Thank you that the Lord does not leave us lost, but speaks to us, guides us, and shows us the way, even when everything seems confusing. Thank you that your voice still echoes within us, bringing direction, peace, and purpose. Now, Father, we ask you, create in us a pure mind, clean of all confusion, fear, and deception. As it is written, create in me, O God, a clean heart, and renew in me a right spirit. Psalm 51:10. Remove, Lord, every thought that does not come from you. Take away from within us every doubt that paralyzes, every anxiety that confuses, every voice that is not aligned with your truth. Teach us to discern, Father. It gives us spiritual sensitivity to recognize when the Lord is speaking to us. May we identify your voice in the midst of so many thoughts, and may it be clear, steady, and unmistakable within us. As thy word says, teach me to do thy will, for thou art my God. Psalm 143:10. We want to learn, we want to listen, we want to obey. Strengthen us, Lord, to live what you are showing us. Give us the courage to make decisions guided by you, faith to trust even when we don't understand everything, and constancy to remain steadfast on the path you have prepared. We also place before you all the areas of our life. Touch, Lord, the health of those who need healing, bringing complete restoration. He visits families, bringing reconciliation, peace, and unity. It opens doors of provision for those facing financial difficulties and brings direction to every important decision that needs to be made. Now, in silence, each one presents before you that which is in the depths of the heart. Needs, pains, dreams, requests that only the Lord knows. Father, we commend everything into your hands. Our thoughts, our plans, our future. We trust that you know best, and that your will is perfect. May your Holy Spirit guide us in every thought, in every choice, in every step. May your peace, which passeth all understanding, guard our minds and hearts, and that, from today on, we can live guided by your voice in a constant and true way. We pray in faith, trusting in you, in Jesus' name. Amen. If this prayer expresses what is in your heart, write Amen in the comments and also present your request, because together, in faith, we believe that God is listening and is already acting. Throughout everything you have heard so far, a truth has been revealed clearly and profoundly. God speaks, and many times He speaks within your own mind. Those thoughts that bring peace, Direction, correction, courage, and purpose are not random. They are signs of a living communication between you and heaven. This message is for you and not by chance. God chose you to hear this today because there is something within you being awakened, aligned, and transformed. From now on, the way you see your own thoughts will never be the same. But the question that remains is, are you willing to stop, discern, and obey when God speaks to you again? I am very happy to know that we are together on this spiritual journey. There's something special going on here, and you're a part of it. I want to invite you from the heart to strengthen this message. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell to continue receiving these words that edify. And more than that, I want to meet you. Comment below from where you are watching, and if you feel in your heart, share what God has spoken to you today, or even a prayer request. Let's create together a chain of faith where lives are touched, restored, and directed by the voice of God. And prepare your heart, because it doesn't end here. In the next video, you'll dive even deeper into this spiritual journey, understanding how to live steadily in God's presence and how to keep your mind aligned with Him every day. There is a next level of intimacy, clarity, and direction waiting for you, and it all starts with the decision to continue. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater, and His presence is our strength. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life and see you in the next video.